I couldn't get through to him. And so at the time, I just remember feeling like this glass wall between us and me reaching out to him and him reaching out to me. That was when I learned I can still speak spirit to spirit.
Hello, you're listening to The Rare Life. I'm your host, Madeline Cheney. Today I have for you Wendy's story. Wendy is mom to 9 children, one of which is Ammon, a 15-year-old boy with a rare syndrome and autism. Ammon didn't receive either of these diagnoses until he was 5 and then 9, and that really affected Wendy's journey. In this episode, she shares how traumatic it was to worry about her son and to have those concerns minimized and not taken seriously by those around her. She then tells us the incredible story of his eventual diagnosis of an extremely rare syndrome and how her grief was affected by that. There are so many moments during this conversation that I know will resonate with you, and I'm really excited to share it with you. Okay, so now for how I was connected with Wendy. It's kind of a cool story. So another of her 9 children is Brian, my little sister's husband. Wendy is my sister's mother-in-law, and Ammon is her brother-in-law. So I'm not sure what that makes me and Wendy relational-wise, but I can tell you that when I found out that Sarah was dating this great guy with a younger brother with a rare syndrome, and also how close they were, I was so excited. And I'm sure you guys of all people understand why I was excited. So my sister Sarah told Wendy about the podcast, and she's been a loyal listener ever since. Anyway, I think it's a pretty cool connection to have. And, I've met Ammon and I've been to their home several times, and watching Ammon interact with his mom is the sweetest thing. Okay, so Wendy lives in Utah with her husband, Andrew, and their 9 children. Natalie, who's 24, Brian, my brother-in-law, who's 23, Zach, who's 21, Landon, who's 19, Sam, who is 17, Ammon, who is 15, Ellie, who is 12, and their 9-year-old twins, Simon and Luke. Wendy is a lover of vintage books and hiking in the mountains behind their home. Let's jump in. Hi, Wendy. Welcome to the show.
Thank you so much.
Yes, I'm really excited to chat with you tonight all about your life with Ammon and kind of your diagnosis saga, or, your journey in having diagnoses for him. But first, I would love for you to start out by kind of sharing who Ammon is and what makes Ammon Ammon.
So Ammon is 15 years old, and he is almost 6'4". He is just this huge, lovely person. And he is a big, huge fan of Rice Krispie cereal. He thinks that it's really awesome to go in our cupboards and just get out a mixing bowl, and he wants to fill his whole bowl with Rice Krispies. So we have to manage that all the time. But he is just delightful, and he is non-speaking. He uses an iPad to communicate his basic needs and wants. He tells us a lot on his iPad over and over when it's time to go home if we're somewhere, or he'll say, I want pizza. I want pizza. He'll just repeat those things. But developmentally, he's it just depends, because he's probably more like about an 18-month-old in a lot of ways. Mm-hmm. But he has these amazing things where he can read. He can read he's probably on about a 7th grade reading level. Wow. 6th to 7th grade. So, he can read, and even though he's non-speaking, he can sing, which is really an unusual thing I don't think I've ever seen a child who wasn't able to talk, but then can sing.
Right. Like lyrics and everything, right?
Yeah, lyrics and everything. So, you kind of have to be his family to know what he's singing, but you can hear the tune. And if you're plugging in, you can you can hear the song. So it's, to me, I feel like that's quite remarkable. So
Yeah.
I have a favorite song that makes me think of Ammon. It's called Extraordinary Magic by Ben Rector. When I think of Ammon, there's magic trails behind him. He is such a unique person. I've had so many people tell me how unique he is and how guileless and just the perfect pure love that he has. So
I love Ammon. Well, that was a good little overview. So let's hop into his pregnancy and then going through his birth. So we're going to start day one, negative 4 months, whatever, when you first noticed anything different about Ammon or unique about him or your pregnancy with him.
So my pregnancy was normal. The delivery was normal. He was full term. And then I just remember when I held him for the first time, I had this feeling inside of me that something wasn't right. Looking back, I think, how could I have known that just holding him for the first time? But something in my mom heart told me that there was just something not right. And then right around 3 and 4 weeks and 5 weeks, he wasn't smiling. I couldn't even engage him, and he just slept. And he's my 6th baby. And so, I kind of knew infants more at that time and felt more confident in the development stages of an infant, and just noticed that he was sleeping so much as an infant, which most moms would just be so happy about. But for whatever reason, I just kept having these little alarms go off in my heart and just in my mind, just thinking, well, that's, just seemed unusual. And then right around 4 months and 5 months where babies are engaging more, he would smile and he was such a happy, sweet baby. But then I started noticing that he wasn't having any strength in his lower limbs. Like a 6-month-old can kind of bounce on your lap and jump on your lap, and his legs would just buckle under him. And so at my regular appointments with my doctor, I said, I just noticed that he's not able to have any kind of strength in his legs. And also his head was just getting so big, so fast. And so we did a CAT scan, and that was normal. And then my doctor just said, he's such a chubby baby. He'll catch up. I just kept getting patted on the back. And then by his 9-month appointment, my doctor finally was listening to me. And I'm just like, there is something not right. I could sit him in a room full of marbles and he wouldn't put anything in his mouth.
Oh, wow.
And he never explored the world through his mouth like so many babies do. And so he referred me to early intervention at that time and a physical therapist. And we started doing physical therapy for his legs. And then we just started noticing he didn't have the pincer grasp. He wasn't putting anything in his mouth. Anything that I tried to feed him, he would gag and throw up. And so he just wasn't even swallowing very well, except for liquids. And so it seemed like to me, I wanted the world to stop and just pay attention that all of these alarms were going off in my mind, but I wasn't receiving, to me in my mind, the reaction or the response to the gravity that I was feeling. It was more like, oh, he'll just need some therapy and then he'll catch up. And now just turning around and looking over that span of his development and just how hard won every single thing he's ever done has been, it's kind of astounding. Just reflecting on it today when I was preparing for this, I was just thinking, I still have feelings that come up that are just kind of traumatic, really traumatic, actually, for just the lack of response to that.
I think, at least this has been my experience and listening to a lot of other parents in our realm, especially, it's like pediatricians often see themselves as these reassuring, oh, it's okay. You're freaking out over nothing. It'll all work out. But that is the opposite reaction we want. We don't want to be reassured. We want to be validated and for it to be taken seriously so that our children can get the care they need. So I think like in that moment, you needed help and you needed more reaction and more testing or whatever. But to just kind of be patted on the back, like I'm sure that was really minimizing and incredibly frustrating when you're like screaming into the void and no one seems to be listening to you.
Exactly. I even had some dreams that I even had where I'm yelling, something is wrong with my baby. And just waking up with that feeling of just,
Wow.
and I still remember those dreams. And I remember, Maddie, that you mentioned in one of your episodes how guarded you are with your stories. And I even turned the episode off for a second because I was thinking, wow, I am too. I am extremely guarded with my stories with Ammon. I don't share very much about him. I think it's because there wasn't a response and because it was so minimized that I still carry that to where these stories, my experiences in his life is so profoundly impacted my life and how grateful I am for him and just what I've seen and experienced through him. And I just think it's almost like I don't want to share those things because of those initial months when I was trying to reach out.
Yeah. Well, I mean, like thinking about the definition, I guess, okay, so with 9/11, apparently there were two groups of people who were able to flee and run from the scene of that were actually there in New York. And then there was a group who was trapped, and the people who were trapped experienced huge symptoms of PTSD, and the people who were able to flee did not. Like their trauma was much more simple and able to be worked out a lot faster. So I think of that with this kind of situation where it's like you were not getting the response, you were not able to do what you wanted to do, and being minimized like that probably had kind of the effect, in a way traumatizing effect, of being trapped and not being able to flee or not being able to act the way you should have been able to. And so anyway, I think that reminds me of that concept.
Yeah, well, and it wasn't just with professionals. It's one thing to reach out to a professional, but it's another thing to, as much and dearly as I love my family and even my husband and I, to be honest, he wasn't seeing what I was seeing. And so, I mean, I think people experience this, and I think it does, we do need to hear that. And that's been one of the healing aspects of your podcast for me, is to hear other parents' experiences and to know that I'm not alone in that. And then that, has aided in my own healing of that. So, when your family doesn't respond and in their best intentions just wants to make it better and make you feel better in the moment, that things are going to be okay. He'll catch up, he'll be fine, don't worry. But it doesn't really serve you.
Yeah, totally. Because even like with Kimball, I had a diagnosis, which I feel like aids in like the validity of your concerns, right? It can be like, oh, well, he has this genetic syndrome. Like, that's why I'm so upset. And that can add like, I don't know, almost like credibility to like your worries and stuff. So I imagine that if you don't have that diagnosis yet, but something is up and no one is listening to you, it'd be really hard to like to emphasize enough to them, like, no, something's wrong and I'm worried about him, if you don't have like that diagnosis to. And even when you do have a diagnosis, I think there is still this feeling of needing to like prove to them, how hard it is or how hard your life is, and they just can't understand. But like, especially I think, not having that diagnosis yet probably added to that.
Yeah, I would agree. And, I hope that we're getting better at diagnosing younger, and, pediatricians and developmental pediatricians can hear these stories and, learn from things like this. So.
Yeah, totally. So how long was it before you received his genetic diagnosis? What happened between this time and then when he received that diagnosis, I guess?
So when he was 3, he started walking. Because it had taken him so long to learn to walk, his feet were just so tiny. And when he did walk, both of his inner ankle bones touched the ground when he would walk.
Oh, wow.
And so I had a really good friend who said, you should take him to Shriners Hospital. And this is another sore point, was I just didn't feel like my pediatrician and the other pediatricians that I was talking to were helping me navigate and find resources. I felt like that was part of the angst, was just not only dealing with, all of the emotional side of it, but then trying to learn, how do I navigate and how do I find answers? And carving out that path it's something moms shouldn't have to do when they're just trying to help their child. But so we did that with Shriners. And then when I stopped nursing him at 12 months, he just went right into chronic constipation. And this later, I found out that this is part of his syndrome, but his bowels just did not operate. And how many times I went in and said, his bowels are not working. Like he cannot have a bowel movement. And they said, oh, just give him prune juice or apple juice. And, so now I got a referral to like the colorectal clinic at Primary Children.
So that sounds like it's like kind of snowballing, right? Like these different symptoms of like, whoa, this is like getting more intense. And at this point, you're still not being taken seriously as far as there being an overall diagnosis, right? Like you were still kind of being
right at that time too. I just remember waking up every day and thinking, his childhood is slipping away from me. He wasn't learning any words whatsoever, but that wasn't even the hardest part. The hardest part was he couldn't understand me. And so his receptive language is very, very, very compromised. And it wasn't just that he couldn't talk to me, but I couldn't get through to him. And so at the time, I just remember feeling like this glass wall between us, and me reaching out to him and him reaching out to me. That was when I learned I can still speak spirit to him, which became a very, very real part of our communication and still has to this day. But coming to grips, you think about how much you enjoy when your little ones bring you a truck and show you the truck, or, oh, look outside at the garbage truck, how excited they get, or, anything they want to show you, and how you start seeing the world through their eyes and how magical that can be as you raise your children. And I think looking back, that was the hardest part of everything. I mean, it was one thing for him not to be discovering the world around him, but it was another thing to have this barrier that I felt so intensely as his mom, that he was really staying very infant-like and just wanting so badly to know what he was feeling and thinking. And just every day waking up to that and going to bed thinking another day went by and his childhood keeps moving on. And I felt like I was missing it. Yeah. And this was like 2 years old, and 3 and 4. And then 5 years old, he started having seizures. He was sitting at the counter and he just, his eyes rolled back in his head, and then he went really pale. And so I just thought that was not normal and right. And so I started seeing a neurologist, and they said, oh, he has like a little nest of irregular pathways here on the right side of his brain. And so he said, sometimes that can be a brain tumor. And so we went and had an MRI for him. Unfortunately, it wasn't a brain tumor, but you go on these roller coaster rides of just, oh, okay, should I just prepare, because things just, they weren't getting better, and you just think it's gonna keep getting worse. Yeah. So
what was that like in that time, I guess, when you were waiting for that appointment to go have the MRI and going into that, wondering if he had a brain tumor? Like, what was that like for you?
I think at this point, I was in a place of not believing things were going to get better. I mean, I think I had heard so many false hopes from professionals and from my family. And I kind of dug down inside myself and was kind of in this place where I was bracing for almost anything at that point. And so I just remember feeling just really kind of numb, actually. Very, very numb as far as, like, should I prepare myself for this other thing? And I already went from 0 to 100. Like, in my mind, it was like it was already told me that he had a brain tumor. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Because I just was so used to things happening that were so, I just couldn't wrap my mind around it. So,
Yeah. Yeah. It's like the worst case scenario to you kept happening. So it's like, well, why not this too? And might as well accept it because that'll be more painful to think it might not be that and then to later find it out. And so might as well just assume that that's going to be what's happening. And that was your situation for most of it, was suspecting something and it actually being what it was. So why would it be different?
Yeah, that is a really good way to describe it, because I was still just so wrapped up in those first 5 years were really difficult with grief. And so, yeah, what you said was absolutely true. Absolutely true. Yeah. When he was in kindergarten, we had seen a neurologist up at Shriners Hospital who I absolutely love. She, you have your favorite doctors, and she was, I have to say, one of my top 5 favorite doctors. I absolutely adore her. And she said, I really think Ammon has a genetic syndrome, because all along, we were just told he has pervasive developmental disorder. He's not otherwise specified. Just kept getting those answers from especially my pediatrician. And she said, I really think Ammon has a lot of the features of, a genetic syndrome. And so she referred us to genetic counseling at Primary Children's Hospital in Utah here. And we went, and that day it was just so interesting, because we went in and you never know what to expect at these things. They sat him there on the bed, and they just combed over his entire body. Like, they were looking at how his hair was parted, how his fingers were pointed, the lines in his hands. They were looking into his mouth, the way his eyes were. They were looking at his spine, at his toes. I mean, I just sat there and thought, wow, my little boy is just getting completely, dissected. And I just had no idea what to expect. But they said, we believe it could be, I think they narrowed it down to like 5 different syndromes. But there was one that they didn't test for at the time, and it was called Opitz-Cavaglia syndrome. And I looked it up, and I thought immediately when I read about it, I said, this is what Ammon has. This is it. This has got to be it. And I mean, inside my mom gut was just like, this is it. And I know for so many families, when you're trying to find a syndrome, I mean, it's like finding a star in the sky. I mean, a lot of families go undiagnosed, but I just felt like that was it. So when I looked up, and I was reading about Opitz-Cavaglia syndrome, and then I looked up Dr. Opitz is one of the doctors who was the researcher and the geneticist. And I was looking him up, and it said, oh, he practices in Salt Lake City, Utah. And I thought, oh my goodness, because he was born in Germany, and he practices in Salt Lake City, Utah. So I got on the phone.
Wow.
I got on the phone, and I found his number for his practice up at Primary Children's. And I called the office, and the receptionist answered, and I said, I believe that my son has this syndrome, Opitz-Cavaglia syndrome, and I don't have a referral, but I would love to make an appointment. And, you get so with trying to make an appointment, trying to say geneticist, I thought she was going to say, and it's interesting because it was exactly 10 years ago this week. That's what's
Wow.
we were having this conversation because it was,
oh, that's kind of cool.
Yeah, it was 10 years ago this week that I made that phone call.
Wow.
And I thought she was going to say, yeah, we can see you in July. And this was November. And so I was bracing myself. And in fact, Maddie, I remember where I was when I made this phone call. I remember exactly where I was driving. I still have that memory of where I was driving when I made this phone call. And she said, can you come in next Wednesday? He has an opening next Wednesday.
Oh my gosh.
And I said, we will be there. And this is the day before Thanksgiving. And so I took Ammon early that morning to Salt Lake, which is about a 30-minute drive from us. And the whole time I remember thinking, okay, if it's not it, I'm going to be okay. It's going to be okay. If he says this is not the syndrome, I was just preparing myself the entire drive up. And so I drove up and parked in the parking lot and got him out. And when I was walking up to the front door of his office, on the outside door, the door opened and there was a woman standing there, and she said, I'm Mrs. Opitz. And I love meeting the families that my husband has spent his life, researching and working for. And so that really just caught me off guard. I just thought his wife right here. And so she walked me in and we checked in, and then she walked me back to his office where we met Dr. Opitz. Dr. Opitz he's this tall, just wonderfully kind older gentleman with a German accent. And he sat me down and he said, I know that moms usually diagnose their kids before I do, but I want you to know that this is what your son has. And it was just like, I had a hard time listening to the rest of, it was like a 2-hour appointment because he spent so much time with me. He sat there and he sat Ammon down and he just looked over Ammon, kind of like the genetic counselors did. And he said, he could be the poster child for this syndrome. And the syndrome is kind of like a larger head, and just the way his jaw was and his eyes and his lower set ears. Just the constipation, the seizures. It was just so healing and so validating. And it all came together in this one moment. And here I am sitting in front of the doctor who has spent years and years and years doing the research. And we benefited from that. So he was so kind. And he said, I want you to know that these kids have so many gifts, and just focus on his gifts. And that was what he told me. So
that's incredible.
Yeah.
I could see why that would be so healing when this whole time you were screaming into the void, like something's happening and no one's taking it seriously. And we don't even have a roadmap of any kind. No idea of what to expect, what will happen next. And then to all of a sudden be engulfed in that wise, all-knowing man who has been studying, your roadmap. He knows what to tell you to do. And that ultimate validation to be you discovered this, you knew this is what he had. And, to have that confirmed, I'm sure is just so euphoric.
It was incredible. I just I can't even hardly think about it without weeping, but, I can't tell you how many appointments we had sat through before that time, just trying to figure out what was wrong and trying to figure it out. And, and so, yeah, it was It's amazing. It was like just this wash. It was just this wash, like the grief washing away. And, and we still faced so many mountains to climb, so many mountains, but I felt like then we had some footing. We had our footing at that point where we could climb those mountains. It wasn't just wandering about.
Yeah, that makes so much sense. So, was his autism diagnosis a similar experience, or what was that like? So I know that zooms way ahead
Yeah.
to when he was 9,
Yeah.
right?
So when he was 5, he was still drooling quite a bit. And then he started having autistic like tendencies where we call it humming, and where he makes kind of a low noise where it's stimming. It's kind of like a regulating thing he does. A lot of it was the sensory. We were doing so much therapy at that point. From the time he was little, we were just in therapy appointments every single week. It was interesting because that was another, mom intuition, is like, he has all these autistic like tendencies, which we embraced. And, it wasn't that we were shying away from that at all. And I actually knew we fit in the autism world. I knew we belonged there, but didn't have a diagnosis. And we had been going to the speech clinic for about a year, about twice a week. And so we had been there for a long time at the speech clinic. And a professor actually reached out to me and said, would you like me to evaluate Ammon? And this is when he was 9. He was 9 years old at that time. And yeah, I welcomed that. And we went through those evaluations. And it was really interesting because I just remember the first IEP that I had when Ammon was 3 in preschool, and I walked away devastated by that IEP and just the statistics of everything, like, oh, Ammon's, this percentage in this and this. It was all just so low. And to me,
Right.
I knew those things, but to just sit around a table and hear those things was just devastating for me. But by the time he was 9, I had sat through so many IEPs, and I'd come to a better place where I knew and felt of who Ammon was. And I knew we were going to be on our own journey. And I knew he wasn't defined by, his IEP report. And so I just remember when she called me and said, let's meet. And so I went in, and she was very, very careful with the information she was giving back to me. And I had to reassure her, I'm okay. You can give me this information. I'm okay with this information. Like, I've come to a good place.
Totally.
But he did get an official diagnosis, which was really great, because then, we could move forward. That would just open up other things for Ammon, and it opened up, the autism community for us, which has been a big part of our lives.
Yeah. And that seems like such a difference in, I guess in contrast to the beginning, like you said, where it was more distressing and like, oh my gosh, what's happening? These are red flags, to kind of transform into like, oh no, like this is Ammon. Like I'm totally fine with this diagnosis. and I mean, like, it probably was also like hard in some way. I don't want to like minimize that either, but to have come to that point where you are following his lead and like embracing, all of Ammon, I'm sure that was really cool to see that contrast, to be able to tell her like, no, I'm okay. Like, you can just tell me.
Yeah. It looked bleak on paper, but by the time he was 9, I had seen and felt so much of all of the gifts that he carries. And we had already, I mean, the things that we had already gone through, and, in that point of our journey was, it was a good place. And he was in a good place too at school. And so it was just kind of like, yeah, it's nice to have that diagnosis for him.
Yeah, like that belonging and more community and more resources. So it's just nothing but
Yeah,
good
for sure.
coming of that.
Yeah.
Well, I would love to wrap up with kind of circling back to something you were talking about at the very beginning when you were saying that in the early days, you were like, what is happening? What's going on? And you said it was really difficult because there was that glass between you and Ammon, and you felt like you couldn't really connect with each other. How has that evolved? Like, what is that like today? What's your connection with Ammon?
I enjoy him so much. You know, he still only has a few words that he speaks, and his receptive language is it's slowly building, very slowly building, but it is something to be celebrated every time he learns something new. I mean, I feel like the things that I took for granted in my other kids, I just celebrate so much with Ammon. Like the other day, I said, "Hand me your seatbelt," and he handed me his seatbelt, and I was so excited because, you know, I'll still talk to him as if he can understand me, but there can be moments where I think, wow, he just knew what I asked him. And then I get really excited and he gets really excited and laughs. And what is so sweet about Ammon is that he has such a great sense of humor. And so I can be really silly with him and he gets the silliness, which I absolutely love. And using his iPad has really been, I mean, for me, like a Helen Keller breakthrough in a way, because when he says, I want a car wash. And then I act on it. Let's go do a car wash. You know, I mean, he just, it's like it's clicking for him that I can say something and be responded to. And so these are huge, huge strides. But about 8 or 9 months ago, I was going to pick him up from ABA therapy, and I actually hit someone's dog on the way to go get him. Someone's family dog, and I was so devastated. And so when I picked him up, I had been crying, and so I picked him up, and he got in the car, and I just couldn't hold in my tears. I just was crying, and I buckled him in, and we were driving down the road, and he reached out and touched my cheek, and he said, "Owie." And I said, "Yeah, I'm sad. I mean, I'm really sad." And he got his iPad and he was kind of scrolling through it. And I heard this, love, mom. And it was like, it was the first time that he'd ever told me that he loved me. He expresses it all the time. He loves hugs. Hugs is one of his favorite words. Huggy. He says huggy all the time and hugs. But I mean, for that to happen, and just think about like the grief that I went through for so long because I couldn't feel like I could get to where that would ever happen, and how amazing that felt, and the restored hope of our future, and teaching him to type and communicate, and what that could look like down the road, and how exciting that is, and just shedding all of the timelines away just in Ammon's time. And as we work for it, you know, I feel like he will be able to communicate more than maybe I could even imagine. So I have a lot of hope, which is, it's a good feeling.
That is the sweetest story. Oh my gosh. I love that. And I love how that like illustrates so many parts of like how far he's come, and it's just his love for you and concern for you. That is so sweet.
Yeah.
Oh my gosh.
Well, and I don't know if you may feel this too, like just the guarded hope. You know, there's a guarded hope that I have felt.
Yeah.
Since he was born, or since he was tiny. I've realized that I just guard hope, and it feels good to allow that feeling to to be felt. And yeah, there is hope for that communication.
Yeah. Oh, totally. I'm pretty sure every single person listening can relate to that guarded hope, because I think, again, it kind of goes back to how like a lot of times it was kind of the worst case scenario that happened, or like, we did get the hard news that other people are able to avoid or whatever. So it does feel kind of scary to hope for things, because then you might be disappointed. But those moments when you're like, wow, this actually happened, those are so sweet.
Yeah, especially when it's so unexpected, so.
Yeah. Oh, I love that. Well, thank you so much for sharing your story with Ammon, and, the things that you have gone through with him. I really appreciate it.
Thank you. I love sharing about Ammon. To people that I know will receive it. Feels good.
Yes. To see adorable photos of Wendy and her family, head to their website, therarelifepodcast.com. You can also connect with her on Instagram. I'll put a link for her Instagram account and mine in the show notes. Also in the show notes is a link to the episode she mentioned where I talk about being protective over my stories with Kimball in fear that others won't take them seriously. So that's episode 64. Join us next week for Wendy's special topic episode. It is one every one of us needs to hear, all about processing through guilt and shame when we feel like we've caused our child's disabilities, and when we struggle to do all the things like appointments, etc., that are required of us. Don't miss it. See you then.